My first job out of college was as a production assistant for StoryCorps, a nonprofit that records conversations between everyday people and archives them at the Library of Congress. As part of the project, we conducted legacy interviews, where people sit down with a loved one who's experiencing a serious illness and document their life story. A year into the job, that initiative became very personal. My best friend's mom was dying of cancer, and they wanted to record their own end of life conversation. I flew back to my hometown, audio gear in tow, and one afternoon the three of us curled up on her mom's bed, and I hit record. The moment I will never forget was toward the end of the conversation, when my friend said,
"What do you think I should do when I want to ask you for advice and you're not there anymore?"
And her mom responded,
"Ask anyway. See what happens."
Until recently, I thought of that moment purely as poetic. But with advances in AI-equipped grief technology, the opportunity to get advice from the dead might not be so far off. This is part 3 of Simulated, a series about love and artificial intelligence from Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. So far in this series, we've talked about building friendships with AI-generated characters and developing intimacy with sex robots. Today, the AI Afterlife.
Welcome to Hereafter. Who do you want to speak with today? Say 1 for Jane, 2 for Paul.
2.
Hello, this is Paul. I'm glad to be back. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
For my part, I'm doing well. All right, let's start.
That was AI Paul talking with his real human daughter, Charlotte G., with the help of Hereafter AI, a tech service that allows you to create digital replicas of your loved ones that you can interact with decades after they're gone.
I always thought that it was a mainstay of science fiction, but that's kind of where it belonged and where it would remain. But increasingly, with advances in AI, it's become clear that it's becoming a reality.
That's Charlotte again. She's the news editor for MIT Technology Review, and the avatar of her father you just met is now nearly 4 years old. He was created alongside an AI version of her mom as an experiment of sorts back in 2019.
There was this event called the Virtual Beings Summit, which was put on a few years ago. And I couldn't attend that event myself. I couldn't send a virtual avatar either, but I was interested in speaking with one of the speakers, James Vlahos, who is the co-founder of Hereafter AI, which is this company that we're talking about, which basically takes people's conversations with loved ones and turns them into fairly easy to use apps that they can access through Alexa. So they can basically have conversations with family members like they would with Alexa, but obviously with a lot more personal connection.
So you heard about this. The idea was kind of simmering in your mind, and then the pandemic hit. And it was that period that really kind of shaped the next trajectory of your work with the app. So take me into that time and what was going on for you and your family.
So I live over in London in the UK, and we had some pretty strict lockdowns. During one of those lockdowns, I couldn't see my parents at all. It wasn't legal. So I think there was a period of about 6 months where I only really saw them through, Zoom, WhatsApp calls, stuff like that. And obviously, it makes you think about mortality. It makes you think about the fact that the people that you love won't always be there. So it kind of converged, this idea about, I miss my mum and dad. What am I going to do if they're no longer around? And we were also exploring this topic for a print edition of our magazine. And I just put my hand up and said, I think this is really interesting. And my parents are, thank God, still around. But I would be really interested to test it on them because it's a relatively low stakes way of doing that. And on the one hand, I do sometimes feel a bit fraudulent because I'm testing a technology without really having all the emotions attached to it. But on the other hand, I think it means I can be maybe a bit more kind of objective and detached about it.
Can you walk us through the process of what it looks like to collect data for the app? How does this process work?
For sure. So at the time, it was basically a process of doing hours of interviews with a very friendly woman whose name I believe was Meredith. And in order to compile the questions that we wanted to ask, my sister and I went through a list of questions they suggested, wrote some questions that we wanted to ask, because of course, we have specific memories, like that time that Granny got stuck in the garage, or things that we want to ask. So through a combination of using their suggested questions, writing our own, we came up with these various pages of questions to send to Hereafter, so that their questioner, the lovely Meredith that I mentioned, could pose those questions to our parents and record the conversations.
A few months after the interviews were recorded, Charlotte got an email in her inbox letting her know that her parents were ready to talk. This is that first conversation.
Alexa, open Hereafter.
Welcome to Hereafter. Would you rather speak with Paul or with Jane?
I'd rather speak with Jane.
Hello, this is Jane G, and I'm happy to tell you about my life.
Oh my God.
How are you today?
I'm well, thanks, Mum. How are you?
Good. There's so much to talk about. My childhood, career, and my interests. Which of those sounds best?
Your childhood.
Sure. I got into trouble as a child because I was very independent and I liked to exercise my freedom.
So that was a clip from the podcast In Machines We Trust from the MIT Technology Review. So Charlotte, take us back to that moment. Like, what was it like to interact with these avatars of your parents for the first time?
Oh, it still actually makes me feel kind of emotional, honestly, like hearing that reaction back. It makes me feel comforted in a funny way. I mean, I get that this is weird. A lot of people will be listening to this thinking, this is a really strange thing to do, especially given that your parents are alive. But on the one hand, it kind of pushed me to be like, don't wait. Ask your parents these questions now. Don't talk about their childhood with their book version when they're long gone. We don't discuss this stuff and we wait. And then kind of you just never really get to have those really, human to human conversations with your parents. It's often just like, how's the weather? How's your, it's not about the really deep stuff a lot of the time. At least not in British families. I definitely do find it comforting to think, A, that exists and I have that record there, but also that it's kind of prompted me to just get closer to my parents who are healthy, alive, well, and enjoy that time that I have with them now.
Thanks. That's good to hear. Next, would you rather that I tell you about one of the happiest times in my life or about one of the hardest times?
How fluid of an interaction experience is it? I mean, we hear the kind of robot or your mom saying, like, here are the things we can talk about, but how does it go from there? Like, what happens if you ask a question that she hasn't necessarily recorded an answer to, for example?
Yeah, you can take a wrong turn very easily with this. If it's not in the pre-recorded conversations, it just won't be able to handle your question. Basically, it's the way to think of it is almost more like a library of their memories that you can access rather than a recreation of them as a person. It's almost like, I don't know, if you added like the video, a bit like those paintings that you can interact with in Harry Potter. It reminds me a little bit of that.
That's
but
unless
it's been recorded with the information that you're asking about, it will just go, I don't know. And then the conversation takes a complete, goes to a dead end. You have to change tack. But I actually find that quite reassuring, if you know what I mean. I actually think that the fact that you can see like the sticking plaster and the way that the technology is like jerry-rigged together, the fact you can see that kind of reassures you that, hey, this isn't actually that crazy advanced. It's just the next kind of logical step on from, photo albums or home videos. I don't think it's that crazy different.
That reminds me of something I read from the founder of this program. And the reason why he created Here After AI was really personal. His dad was dying of cancer, and he really wanted to capture his dad's stories before he died. But he wrote in this piece that he wanted the bot to not only showcase who his father was, but how he was, kind of saying he wanted it to show its mannerisms, his outlook. How much of the fullness of who your parents are do you feel like is captured in the app?
Oh, I mean, not that much. I wouldn't say more than like 5% of who they are. Because what you can't get through this app is, the way that they might roll their eyes or shrug their shoulders or, the way they laugh. So it's not really the same. And don't get me wrong, that's not a criticism. Like, that's just inevitable. Technology can't possibly compete with that. And I still think it's a good thing, but I don't think I would ever confuse this for really speaking to an actual person. And I understand that people want to preserve as much of that as they can, but I think we have to be realistic about what technology can and can't do. And we're still a long way from creating something that really, really sounds completely like that person. But that said, when this came out, it was just before ChatGPT. So the technology is advancing so rapidly. So don't hold me to my word on that one.
Allowing cars to drive themselves, composing songs that mimic popular artists, and producing this digital painting that took the top award at a Colorado art show. This is all the work of artificial intelligence. And right now, ChatGPT is rattling the AI world, turning out stunningly humanoid writing. Just ask Douglas Rushkoff.
That is part of a CNN newscast from December 2022. And even if you're not tuned into the tech world, you probably remember the hype of those early ChatGPT days. But before ChatGPT hit the masses, the company behind it, OpenAI, released the language model it was trained on to some beta testers. And that model, GPT-3, inspired coders and innovators alike to get creative and push boundaries. One of those boundaries was the line between the living and the dead. Using borrowed beta tester credentials, Bay Area programmer Jason Rohr created a GPT-3-based interface called Project December. For $5, users could interact with built-in chatbots based on people like William Shakespeare and create custom bots, which is something that appealed to Joshua Barbeau. At that time, in September 2020, Joshua was a 33-year-old freelance writer living in Canada, grieving his late fiancée Jessica, who had died 8 years before. He used Project December to build the Jessica bot, an artificially intelligent chatbot trained on Jessica's old Facebook messages and texts. Years after dying from a rare liver disease, here she was again, a line of words tumbling out across a black screen, with syntax, spelling, and humor that sounded just like her. But how?
So this is a crazy answer, and I promise that this is true, and I'm not just saying this because I don't know. So basically, we don't fully understand how these AI models work. Like when it comes down to literally how does it produce the responses it does, we don't entirely know. We do know that large language models work by essentially approximately guessing what the next word is most likely to be. And if it's been trained on a lot of data from that individual, like this was, then it's basically guessing, well, normally when this person uses this word, this person then will use that word after. So it's kind of like recreating a kind of jigsaw puzzle of how that person uses language. It won't be exactly the same. And it is still, it's basically guesswork, but it's getting pretty accurate and it's getting pretty convincing. Of course, you could also say that when it malfunctions, it kind of the illusion is shattered briefly when you realize, that's not something that person would say. But it's becoming more and more convincing and more advanced.
There is a new model on the market, or a new option of grief tech on the market called You Only Virtual. And you spoke a little bit with the founder, I know, before it actually came out. But could you tell us a little bit about You Only Virtual and how it works?
Sure. So it pretty much works like what we're talking about. It takes your communications with someone and turns that into a chatbot. And this guy built it because his mom, I mean, it's a common story in this sector, unsurprisingly. People build these things because they need them, because the people that they love are dying. And in this instance, for Justin Harrison, his mum was in the late stages of having cancer. And so he said that he communicated with her a lot via text. So he figured he would be able to create a bot that is a kind of rough approximation of his mum. And he's pretty happy with it. But of course, it does mean that it would have to be with someone that you spoke with a lot on text, specifically, not just on conversations like the one that we're having now. So it wouldn't necessarily be suitable for everyone. But for some people, yeah, I can see that working.
Do you know about how consent and privacy works with something like You Only Virtual? Because I can imagine with Hereafter AI, like if I'm going to record my life story, I'm consenting to it because I'm sitting down to do it. But with You Only Virtual, like if someone wants to make something of me, do they get my consent? How does that work?
Yeah, this is actually a pretty major question mark that I have over this technology. I mean, and we're talking about this company specifically, but I'm sure it's true for quite a few companies. If the person that the bot is being created of isn't aware that it's happening, I don't really see how you can guarantee consent will exist. Maybe you could create some way that, that person has to opt in, like if they are still alive and you're creating that bot, maybe there's some way that they can, install the app, tick, yes, I consent to this. But if that person's passed away, they can't consent. And some people would say, well, they're not around anymore. Does it really matter? But I feel like a lot of people would think it does matter. And of course, there's also the slightly kind of weird prospect that you could create it of someone who is A, alive, and B, completely well, and C, doesn't consent, like an ex or, I don't know, someone that you're stalking. Like that's quite a scary idea to me. And I'm sure, can you imagine if you found out someone had made a bot of you that they speak to all the time? You'd be freaked out.
You would be freaked out. You'd feel like you were living in Black Mirror.
You'd be so freaked out.
Hey, y'all, it's Anita. Before we get to the rest of the show, I want to let you know about a new podcast from Slate that I think you are going to love. It's called Well Now. You know that we're living in this era of TikTok health trends and over-reliance on Google for medical advice. So Well Now is going to help you cut through the noise. Hosts Maya Feller and Dr. Kavita Patel will help you get to the heart of what wellness means for you. Every Wednesday, they're going to give you new insights into wellness and how to reach it through conversations with experts and people just like you. Plus, their vibe is super down to earth, honest, and evidence-based. They'll dive into topics we most want to learn about, from the sober curious movement to the lies we're told about exercise to how ER taught thousands of people about cervical cancer. So go ahead and follow Well Now in your podcast app and save it for later. That's Well, Now from Slate. Available wherever you get your podcasts. So, yeah, grief tech certainly opens up a world of creepy possibilities, uneasy feelings, and ethical concerns, which makes it the perfect intellectual stomping ground for any up-and-coming philosopher. So when Alexis Elder, who's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota Duluth, first heard about the tech from an academic colleague, she was fascinated.
I had done some work on some classical Chinese conceptions of death and grief and mourning and had sort of moved on and said something about wanting to get back to that someday. And he said, there's these new grief bots. Maybe that's your opportunity.
So you started looking into this. You realized there were some interesting case studies, real life examples of this technology, why people were creating it. And you came across the story of Eugenia Cuda, who is the CEO and founder of Replica, which is a chatbot technology that we have talked about a bit in this series. Can you tell me a bit more about her story and some of the questions that it raised for you, who someone who thinks about these questions of ethics and death and mourning?
So Eugenia, as I understand it, had seen the Black Mirror episode Be Right Back, which is about constructing first a chatbot and then a voice simulation and eventually a full-on Android replica of somebody's dead partner. And when her business partner, Roman Mazurenko, passed away, she was sort of inspired to put this into practice. So that was sort of an interesting piece for me. But she ended up drawing on both her own history of text conversations with him and inviting some of his friends and family members to contribute, and ended up creating what she calls an online memorial chatbot where folks can go and interact with him. And so it's not perfect. It's not giving like a lifelike or convincing imitation, but folks who knew him and interacted with it have reported that some of the turns of phrase and the patterns of speech, which are the things that generative AI is really good at, are sort of eerily reminiscent of him. and have this kind of evocative quality.
So, Charlotte, when you were doing your reporting on Hereafter AI, you spoke with a variety of psychologists, and they raised a number of concerns about grief technology. Can you talk a bit about some of the things that they brought up to you?
You know, and one thing I will say is actually I was surprised that there weren't more concerns. A lot of the psychologists I spoke to were actually kind of pretty chill about it, which I wasn't really expecting. A lot of them were like, oh, this might actually be a helpful part of grieving. One thing that could become difficult is because, of course, people talk about the different stages of grieving, and the difficulty with spending a lot of time interacting with a virtual bot form of that person is that you could get kind of stuck in the ruminating, sort of thinking, obsessing phase where you just want to remain immersed in that person. And that could kind of make it hard for you to move on because, you know, and I don't think that's such an issue now, but as the technology improves and becomes more convincing, I think that will become more of a risk that you just think, I basically want to stay with this person. I don't want to let go of them. Because part of grief is eventually kind of accepting that they're no longer there.
That is something that does happen in that Black Mirror episode, Alexis, which is that the character ends up spending a lot of time with a robotic version of her ex instead of the people in her real life. Do you think that grief tech could further isolate people? What do you think about that question?
So this is something I'm really interested in. And with a nod to Charlotte's point about the 5 stages of grief, the sort of dominant conceptions of how we grieve have been shifting over the years and away from this idea that the point of grief is sort of closure and moving on, and towards this idea of what some clinical psychologists are calling continuing bonds, which is to some extent like continuing to live with space in your life for the person who mattered to you and whom you've lost. Whether or not people are going to have so much trouble sort of disentangling that from maybe a more pathological engagement, that they have difficulty interacting in reality, I think that's an empirical question and something that we may need to wait and see. But something that I'm interested in as an ethicist is how much our preconceptions about the pathology of grief might be shaping our assumptions about what's useful. And it's interesting to me, if not entirely surprising, that psychologists are maybe more open than we might expect because the idea that there's something harmful about grief and it's something to be gotten over or gotten past are themselves coming into question. And that was one of the things that sort of drove me back to this more Confucian model, is this idea that like living our lives with space to honor and remember and continue to connect with people who have mattered to us might actually be a good thing.
So, Alexis, maybe you could give us a brief overview of the Confucian approach to death and the afterlife and why it called to you as a place to think about these questions about grief tech.
So Confucius and his followers sort of deny interest in or focus on the afterlife. Like they don't say that there is no afterlife. They just, when the question comes up, say basically, we're having enough trouble figuring out how to live. Let's not worry about that right now. But there's a very strong emphasis on social relations as central human concerns and central to how we live well together in communities. And that includes recognition for people as they come into our lives and as they leave them. Like, what do we want to do to welcome people and what do we want to do to commemorate people? And that includes wrestling with difficult questions like, how do we deal with bodies after people have passed away? Not just as an individual psychological problem, but as a social good. How can we continue to organize and support each other in ways that will help us to hold space for our feelings of attachment and longing and affectionate memories for the dead?
This question of how to best commemorate the dead is answered differently in cultures across space and time. In the Western world, common rituals include writing obituaries, organizing funeral processions, and laying flowers on a grave. These practices help us grapple with grief and memorialize those we've lost. And for some people, grief tech is just another tool for commemoration. That's the case for Dr. Stephanie Lucas Onay, who's been interacting with her late father through Hereafter AI since his death in May 2022.
One of the things I always miss when someone dies is their voice. The idiosyncratic phrases and their personality that's reflected in it. In the past, I used to keep voicemails after people died just so I could hear their voice again.
Good morning. Just thought I would give you a call and see what you were up to. See you later. Bye.
When my father died, I got a hereafter AI avatar to keep a part of him alive so present and future generations could remember his story and interact with him in a meaningful way. I have hours of videotape and thousands of pictures of my father. I realized, though, that the information that I accrued over the years was static and would not convey the true essence of my father. I therefore sent a questionnaire to each of my siblings and to each of his grandchildren and asked them what they would like to know about their grandfather. My siblings and all of the grandchildren were with me when I first used the avatar. Hearing my father's voice again brought us joy, but we also shed some tears. The grandchildren were curious about his childhood and his younger years. His avatar told them stories about his life that they would have never known. My siblings asked for his advice on different topics. I now interact with the avatar using the app either on my phone or on my computer about once or twice a month. It is my hope that the wisdoms and strength of character and perseverance and resiliency that my father instilled in me and my siblings can be passed on to future generations through use of this avatar.
This idea of a virtual avatar that you can return to over and over again reminds me of other digital memorials that remain intact long after the dead have passed on. I personally know a few people whose Facebook pages have become memorial sites since their passing. And Alexis says this is actually becoming an increasingly common phenomenon.
There's a sort of line in the tech ethics community that Facebook might not have set out to be a virtual graveyard, but as users die, it's kind of become one where people will go back to somebody's Facebook profile and post on sort of important occasions, things like birthdays or anniversaries. And I think those sort of speak to an open question that people individually and together face, which is like, how much do we want to keep coming back to the dead? How important is it to sort of have a sustained relationship versus to sort of move on? And I think cultures and individuals are both kind of divided about that. We do have practices of, I'm just thinking about like cremation and scattering the ashes as a way of kind of both symbolically and literally letting people become one with the world, but also questions about how much we want to preserve affections and connections. And to me, that's one of the fascinating things about connecting this contemporary issue back with classical Chinese philosophy, is that was something that was being debated then too. There was a cultural tradition of connecting remains to a gravesite, but that was being actively challenged by other philosophical schools at the time. It was certainly not taken for granted.
There's also this communal aspect to grief that you get in something like a physical funeral, going to a site. You maybe get even a little bit on a Facebook page where you're seeing other people interacting with the memorial site. How could this kind of grief tech be used in a communal way? Like, I guess the examples we have of it are people kind of sitting alone in their room chatting with a grief robot. Is there a communal potential for this technology?
I think this is something that is really interesting. And to me, Eugenia Kaida's online memorial to Roman Mazurenko might come closest to that, is just having the chatbot available to others, right? Having a space in which getting together and conversing with a chatbot might be a practice that the family engages in together. And different people might use that as an occasion to sort of share their own memories or stories, or introduce the younger generation to, what grandpa sounded like talking about something or telling a story. So one of the interesting things for me about emerging technologies is we're not just saying like, how do people do this? We're asking normative questions like, how do we want to use this? How should we use this? And to some extent, like the options are open to us.
We've been talking so far about much more personal use cases of these kind of digital artifacts, like someone's recording of their grandmother that's shared within the context of their family. But you've come across some examples of instances where digital artifacts of the dead were less kind of private and also less well received, including an instance where a professor's lectures were used to teach a remote class after he died. Can you tell me a little bit about that story and some of the ways it highlights potential ways this tech could go wrong?
Yes, absolutely. We have a number of social norms and cultural values around respect for the dead that put some important limits on how and when and where we can use remains, and that's starting to spill over to the digital environment as well. During the pandemic, our university recycled some recorded lectures from a professor and sort of ran them in an online course in such a way that the students were not clear on the fact that the grading and execution of the course were being done by a living person, nor was it made clear to them that this professor that they saw as teaching their course had passed away. And one of the students searched for his contact information to send him an email or something and came up with his obituary. And the students were horrified, I think rightfully so. So we're sort of left with this question, like we have existing norms and laws, and we may need to update those as we continue to have conversations and think about what constitutes appropriate, respectful, exploitative, manipulative use of the dead. Identifying the questions that we need to ask and resolve together is really interesting and is work that I'm trying to do.
The other example that comes to mind for me is the Anthony Bourdain documentary, where after he died, they recreated certain sentences said in his voice and put those in a documentary without necessarily alerting to the audience that that was the case. Can you remind us what happened there and some of the questions it raised for you?
Yes. So as I understand it, a filmmaker actually secured the consent of Bourdain's estate, but created some audio deepfakes of Bourdain seemingly reading out some letters that he had actually written. And there was some public outcry around this, especially among folks who really appreciated Bourdain's authenticity and sort of openness. And it seemed to, like, contrary to the ethos that they associated with him, to have this sort of calculated PR move, basically. To me, it does a couple of things. First, reading out loud is still a creative endeavor, and I don't think that the calls that the deepfake made are necessarily the ones we should expect or associate with Bourdain himself. But more generally, I'm worried that ongoing access to people's works, and this includes both the deceased professor and some of Bourdain's recordings, can make it easy to think that these are just kind of like resources to be exploited for often the financial benefit of the living. And that seems to me deeply disrespectful, to kind of reduce people to the value of their outputs rather than appreciating them as individuals who are sort of unique and meaningful sources of value. Like, part of remembering and respecting somebody might consist of letting them be sort of full human beings and not merely thinking about how to make them do the work we want them to. And that seems to be something that's undercut by this sort of easy availability of digital remains without constraints on how they might be used to benefit other people's interests.
There are some people who've suggested strategies to help navigate these questions while people are still living, like a type of do not resuscitate order that, like, could be part of your will, where you're like, do not reanimate me, like, don't use my voice. Do you foresee any other options to help people navigate their role in their digital selves before they die? How should we be thinking about this?
I certainly could see that becoming a sort of more normal part of conversations about disposal of somebody's belongings, like just like I might include in my will who gets my tea set. I might also have some things to say about what can or can't be done with my digital remains. But I think there are reasons to think this is going to be difficult to scale up, in part because there's so much more in the way of digital footprints that we leave behind that it may not even be sort of feasible to keep track of all of those. We may have different interests in relations to them. And just more generally, we may not be able to anticipate all the uses to which they might be put. So I think one of the things we need to do is think about death as everyone's problem. This isn't just about extending one person's interest into the future, but thinking about how do we, the living, want to continue to mourn and remember and show respect for the dead and recognize the extent to which respect is incompatible with an overly exploitative attitude.
So all this begs the question, who is this technology for?
Hello, my angel.
Hello, Mummy. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, darling?
Yes, I'm well.
That's Charlotte G. again. And this time you're hearing her talk to her real mom, Jane, over the phone. And they're going to help me answer a question that we can no longer ask Anthony Bourdain, the late professor, or the Jessica bot.
How do you feel about being in bot form, potentially, after you've passed away? Does it comfort you or does it creep you out? How does it make you feel?
I actually think my feelings about it are not terribly relevant, if I'm honest. I think it's a valid question, a perfectly valid question.
Yeah.
But the point of having the bot is to enable those who you are leaving behind to answer some of the questions that perhaps they didn't think to ask you while you were alive.
Yes.
So in a sense, I would think that the main purpose isn't directed towards the person who is the bot.
While Charlotte's tech experiment has helped her look head-on at her parents' mortality, there's a lot we don't know about how ghost bots could impact our lives and relationships. Alexa says that when you're building tech, you really need to know what the goal is. And the thing about grief is that culturally, we are pretty undecided about what we want. After a loss, should we be trying to make ourselves feel better or learning to live with the pain? Acknowledging these questions is essential for a healthy GhostBot future.
I think having more open conversations is going to be key. It's definitely true that different people are going to have different interests and different concerns and different preferences. And I think there are some features of infrastructure that's supporting a lot of technology development that has this kind of like throw it out on the market and see what sticks. And I think for questions like mortality, this isn't to say that everybody needs to settle on one way always, but we need to think about these as social conversations involving important values that we need to work out together. And so I'm really interested in what it takes to have those kinds of conversations where we can sit down and go, where do we want to go? Like building that question into both the development and use of technology is as important as having a worked out goal.
Well, did you enjoy hearing about that?
Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. This was the final installment in our series, Simulated. If you missed any of our earlier episodes about AI chatbot relationships or the arrival of the sex robot, definitely go back and give them a listen. A special thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lucas-Onay for her contributions to this episode. The show was produced by Gabriella Glick and edited by Kaya Finlay. Paige Miranda also produces for our show. Skylar Chadwick is our intern, and Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer. Amanda Magnus is our regular editor, and Quilla wrote our theme music. A special thanks to Sean Rue for mastering today's show. If you like this show and enjoyed our 3-part romp through the world of AI and love, we'd be thrilled to hear about it. Write a review and let us know why you listen, or text your favorite episode to a friend. Word of mouth recommendations are the best way to support our podcast. Until next time, I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you. I have to assume that the people who love Valentine's Day spent their middle school years completely protected from awkward interactions with their crushes and are now safely ensconced in a loving relationship, maybe even with someone who has the exact same love language. For everyone else, it can be kind of uncomfortable, right? That's why I'm suggesting we reframe the entire month of February to be less about performing your love and more about learning how to love yourself and other people better. To kick off this effort, I pulled together a starter kit of articles, songs, podcast episodes, and even a Google form to get us started on a different approach to the month of love. You can find them all in my Pocket collection. Pocket is a website and app that finds the most thought-provoking articles from trusted sources all around the internet and puts them in one place. With Pocket, you can find news stories to read, save podcasts and videos for later, and even have saved articles read aloud to you, starting with my collection. You can find it at getpocket.com/embodied.